This is Mungo Dark Matter, and welcome to Dark Matters. Today on Dark Matters, we're going to discuss open source. Open source is kind of the hippie answer to copyrights, because copyrights actually protect the creator of a work to ensure, they get just compensation for their work. But eventually, all copyrighted works go into the public domain, and sometimes the creator of the work will put it into the public domain because they want it in the public domain. The problem with the public domain is other people can kind of make some changes to that creative work and copyright it themselves. And what happens is a lot of times it makes it hard to get a copy of the original public domain work so that you can redistribute it, but these other people have control over it. So it's kind of like evil corporations getting control over something that should have been in the public domain and charging you for it. Now, the people in open source really don't have a problem with people making a fair profit off of redistributing something because there's costs associated with that, but they don't want a lot of profiteering off of it. And they want people to be able to get the free version always. So what open source does is it's actually copyrighted by the person or group of people that created it, but the license stipulates certain things about how the software can be used. And one of the main things is that if you are profiting off of it, you need to be distributing the original free version too. So you might come up with a commercial version of a piece of software that's open source, and you might package it nicely, you might put manuals with it, you might provide support, and you can charge for all that legitimately, but you may be required also to have a version on your website that people can download freely and not pay you at all for it. Or you may be required to at least distribute the software maybe on a CD at a minimal price, like say $5, so you recover the cost of creating the CD and mailing it out, but not much more. So that's the idea behind open source. We create a bunch of works. They can be software, they can be information, and we can share that, and we'll keep it shared for free. So I'm going to go over a couple of open source projects to give you an idea of what they're like. Now, really one of the first open source projects, although a lot of these projects weren't called open source at the beginning because they had different names for them, because the idea has been around longer than the name open source has. The name open source actually comes from the idea that you create software and you make the source code available. And if a programmer has a source code, they can recompile and change the software. And there are various licenses in the open source movement. One of the first projects came about in 1971, which was Project Gutenberg, in which they actually took works that were in the public domain and put them in electronic format and made them available for free, like the works of Shakespeare, for example. Now, if you make your own edition of Shakespeare and change the spelling around a little bit, do a few edits, put some footnote notes in, you can copyright that edition because you've done a lot of work on it, and so you have the rights to that. But in the past, you didn't have to make the public domain version available. So you could go find an 1840 copy of Shakespeare that was out of copyright, and generally anything over 75 years right now that was published over 75 years ago is probably out of copyright. You could take the 1840 version and make your own edition. And if you had the only copy of the original 1840 version, then you kind of block other people from taking that version and redistributing it for free or making their own edition of it. And so the idea behind open source is that you still have to provide the ability for other people to get the absolutely free version too, even though they might want to buy your version because it's much nicer, because it's edited and footnoted fabulously. So that's the idea behind open source. So Project Gutenberg's put out a lot of books. There, you can even get them on Kindle now that were put out by Project Gutenberg. And just volunteer people have found old copies of Shakespeare and other works and made sure they were out of the copyright and in the public domain, and they just started keying them in on their computer. And I'll put the links to some of these projects I'm mentioning in the description of the video if you want to look at them more, and Project Gutenberg will explain their process and how they figure out if the thing's in or out of copyright and what their license is and such. Another big step was in 1989. There was something called the GNU General Public License, which was created for a software project they had at the time. And that's used in a lot of software projects now, or modified. So the license itself was put into the public domain so other projects could use it. So you may have heard of the GNU license or the GNU General Public License. And that's one of the more popular licenses that have been used throughout the year. Another project is Wikipedia. And Wikipedia, you've probably seen before. It's at wikipedia.org. And they have a free encyclopedia. And basically, it's a wiki. And a wiki is a piece of software that allows multiple people to edit and add to, like a manual or an online work of text or documentation. And the Wikipedia is an encyclopedia built in a wiki. And there are, thousands of people that contribute to this, and there are people in that organization who kind of edit it, but anybody can actually add or edit the Wikipedia. It's a little controversial because there is always the possibility that somebody's going to put bad information in there, either accidentally or on purpose. And so that's always a danger, although they have done tests on the Wikipedia, and it is actually fairly accurate according to some tests. And even a regular encyclopedia might not always be as accurate as you'd like it. They also put in the Wikipedia references a lot of times in the articles, and they'll kind of rank articles. They'll flag problems with them for the editors to look at and the people reading it to look at. So you've got to take Wikipedia with a grain of salt. Always shouldn't be your only source, but it is a pretty good general source. At least I found that. Linux, which is an operating system, is another open source project. Actually, there are multiple open source projects with Linux, creating various versions and distributions of Linux, which we won't get into here. Fedora is a project that creates one of those versions, and there are many different distributions of Linux. And those are made up actually a lot of times of multiple open source projects. So they include other software that are open source, and the distribution are people bringing together various open source projects. Another very popular project is OpenOffice, which is now called Apache OpenOffice, which is a replacement for Microsoft Office. So it has like a word processor, a spreadsheet, a database, a presentation piece of software in it. And the idea is to be able to let people use those applications without having to pay Microsoft or another company a lot of money for them. You could literally download OpenOffice, and particularly if you just needed like a word processor and a spreadsheet, you could get along fine with that piece of software. I use it a lot myself, although I also use Microsoft Office on various machines, but I use OpenOffice a lot. It works really great. If you're in college and you're on a budget, Microsoft gives you licenses of Office at a break for students a lot of times. but OpenOffice is totally free. So that's something to keep in mind. You can always use open source software to kind of get software that you may not want to pay the money for, or you can't afford, or if it's a piece of software you're only going to use a couple of times anyway, you might not want to spend the money for a full version. Now, a lot of the commercial versions may have advantages or fuller features, but some of the older open source projects have a lot of features on them too, so it's always something that you can look at. Another open source project is Firefox, which is the open source web browser, and that's available at mozilla.org. And as I said, that's your open source web browser that you can use instead of Internet Explorer. Now, Internet Explorer is free, but there are advantages to the open source version of the software too. You've got also Chrome, which is available free from Google, and I don't think that classifies as an open source project, because I don't think they have the source open on that at this point. I'm not really sure on that. I'd have to check. But some companies actually make their own software open source, or parts of it or versions of it open source, to allow people to use for various reasons. The final piece of software or software project is MySQL, which is an SQL server, which is a database server. And so that's a pretty big piece of software used by companies more than it would be by individuals. And the key with open source is it allows people with some knowledge to do a lot of things they may not have the money to buy all the software for that would be commercial. Advantage of commercial software is a lot of times some or all of the support is kind of incorporated into it, and the interfaces may be a little easier to use in some cases. With open source, the model is companies that distribute it commercially are really charging for their support of that software. So you can actually get it free and get no support, or you can pay for a version and get support for it. And that's the idea behind open source a lot. I'm Mungo Dark Matter, and this has been Dark Matters, and whatever you do, enjoy technology.